Walter stared at the letter that had come through his door, telling him when and where he should present himself. The one thing he knew, as the winter of 1942 gave way to the first intimation of spring, was that he would refuse to be removed from his own country. It struck him as a stupid instruction. Hi, hello, and welcome to the Friday's reading on Notes and Notion podcast. We're continuing with reading the book The Escape Artist of Jonathan Freedland. And last time we left off Walter and friend at Auschwitz. We heard about their escape. And in this new chapter called Star, we're going to hear more about Walter's upbringing and his schooling and his life as a teenager in Slovakia, just as war started. Let's get into it. From the start, he knew he was special. He was not yet Rudolf Vrba that would come later. His name was Walter Rosenberg. He had only to look into his mother's eyes to know he was one of. Ilona Rosenberg had awaited so long for him, desperate for his arrival. She was already a stepmother. Her husband, Elias, came with 3 children from a previous marriage, but that was not the same as holding a baby of her own. For 10 years, she had yearned for a child. The doctors told her she should stop hoping. So when Walter arrived on 11 September of 1924, she greeted him like a miracle. She doted on him, as did his half-siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, all of them more than a decade older, with Sammy and Fancy in particular more like an uncle and aunt than a brother and sister. The object of the kind of attention usually reserved for only child. Little Walter was preciously clever. He was 4 or 5 when Fancy, keen to meet up with her boyfriend, would drop Walter off in the one-room schoolhouse where her friend worked, so that someone other than her could keep an eye on him. He was meant to play or crayon in a corner, but she would return to find the teacher pointing to Walter Rosenberg as an example to be followed by the other children, some of them twice his age. "Look how well Walter is doing his work," she would say. He was not much older when his family would find him quietly turning the pages of a newspaper. He was born in Popochan, in the west of Slovakia, but close to the middle of the new land of Czechoslovakia that had been created just 60 years earlier. Before long, the family had sold up and headed to the far east of the country, edging close to Ukraine, to Yaklovce, a speck on the map so forgettable trains would pass through without ever stopping. They could not stop. There was no station, not even a platform. So Walter's father, the owner of a local sawmill, took it into his head to build a platform and modest waiting area, a structure which to Walter's delight doubled as the family's sukkah during the autumn week when Jews are commanded to demonstrate their faith in the Almighty by eating their meals in the temporary huts exposed to the heavens. The young Walter enjoyed life in the country. The family kept chickens, with pride of a place given to an egg-laying hen. When the parents noticed that eggs were going missing, Fancy was ordered to keep watch. Perhaps a fox was riding the hen house. One morning, Fancy discovered the culprit, and it was an unlikely predator. Her little brother was breaking into the coop, stealing the eggs and eating them raw. The Rosenbergs did not stay in the village long. Elias died when Walter was 4 years old, so Ilona headed back west, where the family had roots. Now she needed to make her own living. She went out on the road, a traveling saleswoman, supplying or altering the lingerie and other wear she made herself. But it was hardly the ideal setup for raising a young child. She once left Walter with a friend, what Ilona would have called a kept woman. Angry with the patron who had discarded her, the woman bribed Walter to pretend that he was the couple's love child, as she parted around town loudly complaining about and naming the terrible man who had abandoned her and his darling little boy. Walter was rewarded for this performance with a trip to the bakery and whatever cake he fancied. After that, Ilona decided that her son should live with his grandparents in Nitra. It worked out well. Walter soon formed a strong bond with his grandfather, who raised him in the customs of strictly Orthodox Judaism. Occasionally, he might run an errand that took him to the home of the much respected rabbi, and on Fridays, Walter would follow his grandpa as he and all other men headed to the river, using it as mikvah, submerging their bodies in the water, making of it a ritual bath where Jews cleanse themselves in preparation for the Sabbath. Walter liked tradition and he loved his grandparents. He was happy. The only cloud in the sky was a variant of sibling rivalry with the Viennese cousin Max, who was a couple of years older than him. Walter knew his grandfather took pride in his achievements in school, but he suspected that the old man liked Max more. After his grandfather had a fall, and Walter's grandfather decided he could no longer bring up the young boy alone, Walter was dispatched to a Jewish orphanage. There, he impressed his teacher once more with his studiousness. Asked to name his hobbies, he would say languages and reading, though he didn't make time to play football, and the headmaster suggested to Ilona that she should enroll her son in one of the city's elite high schools. It would mean establishing a permanent residence in Bratislava and hiring a young woman to act as Walter's guardian while she remained on the road. But if the best was available to her boy, Ilona was determined that he should have it. When the time came to pose for a class photograph in the autumn of 1935, the outline of the man to come was visible. Just 11 years old. He may have looked a little nervous, but he already had presence. His dark hair swept over to one side, and with the thick, dark eyebrows that would accompany him for life, he sat straight-backed, regarding the lens with intensity. The other boys did as they were told and posed with their arms folded, but not Walter. He was still wearing tzitzit, the traditional fringed vest of the devout Jewish male, but his mother had made a cummerbund for him to keep the tassels hidden. The peyos, or side curls, which Walter would have worn in Nitra, were gone. For the first time, he was free to make his own religious decisions, without the influence of either his grandfather or the orphanage. One afternoon, strolling the streets of Bratislava with some lunch money in his pocket, he decided to put God to the test. He went into a restaurant and ordered pork. He took the first bite and waited for the bolt of lightning to strike. When it did not come, he made up his mind and made a break. Pupils at the gymnasium were given a choice of religious instruction: Catholic, Lutheran, Jewish, or none. Walter chose none. On his identity papers, in the space set aside for nationality, he could have entered the word Jewish, but instead chose Czechoslovakia. At school, he was now learning not only German, but High German. He had struck a deal with an emigrant pupil. Each boy would give the other advanced lesson in his native tongue. In the class picture for 1936, his gaze is confident, even cocky. He is staring straight ahead into the future. But in the photograph for the academic year of 1938 and 39, there was no sign of 14-year-old Walter Rosenberg. Everything had changed, including the shape of the country. After the Munich Agreement of 1938, Adolf Hitler and his Hungarian allies had broken off chunks of Czechoslovakia, parceling them out between them, and by the spring of 1939, what was left was sliced up. Slovakia announced itself as an independent republic. In reality, it was a creature of the Third Reich, conceived with the blessing and protection of Berlin, which saw in the ruling ultra-nationalist Hlinka, or Slovak People's Party, a mirror of itself. A day later, the Nazis annexed and invaded the remaining Czech lands, marching in to declare a protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. while Hungary seized one last chunk for itself. Once the carve-up was done, the people who lived in what used to be Czechoslovakia were all, to varying degrees, at the mercy of Adolf Hitler. In Slovakia, the teenage Walter Rosenberg felt the difference immediately. He was told that no matter the choice he had made for religious studies, and the word he had put in the nationality box on those forms, he met the legal definition of a Jew. It was older than 13. Therefore, his place at Bratislava High School was no longer available. His education was terminated. All across the country, Jews like Walter were coming to understand that although the new head of the government was a Catholic priest, Father Joseph Tiso, the state religion of the infant republic was Nazism, albeit in Slovak denomination. The anti-Semites' enduring creed held that Jews were not merely unreliable, untrustworthy, and irreversible foreign, but also endowed with almost supernatural powers, allowing them to wield social and economic influence out of all proportion to their numbers. So naturally, the authorities in Bratislava moved fast to blame the country's tiny Jewish community of 89,000 population of 2.5 million for the fate that had befallen the nation, including the loss of cherished territory to Hungary. Propaganda posters appeared plastered on brick walls. One showed a proud young Slovak, clad in the black uniform of the Hlinka Guard, kicking the backside of a hook-nosed, side-curled Jew, the Jew's purse of coins falling to the ground. In his first radio address as the leader of the newly independent republic, he made only one firm policy commitment: to solve the Jewish question. After Walter's expulsion from school, Ilona abandoned her work as a traveling saleswoman, and the pair moved to Trnava, a small town 30 miles east of Bratislava. It was a shock after the capital. Here, all life and multiple narrow lines converged on a central square named for the Holy Trinity and dominated but not one but two churches. In summer, Trnava was a cloud of heat and dust, the marketplace reeking of manure, hay, and human sweat, the whole town overwhelmed with the stench emanating from the nearby sugar plant as it processed beet. A skip could be found in the countryside with its flat fields of ripe corn and fresh breezes only a cycle ride away. But if the Rosenbergs, mother and son, were hoping for refuge, they had come to the wrong place. The government's determination to tackle the so-called Jewish question reached even here, touching small town Trnava with its community, or fewer than 3,000 Jews, whose two synagogues stood a matter of yards apart. Not that the God people of Trnava needed much prompting. They had set fire to both synagogues a matter of weeks after Slovakia had gained its autonomy in December 1938. Walter soon joined up with a group of Jewish teenagers who, like him, had been banished from their realm of learning. On the first day of term, the schools had hung signs on their gates announcing Jews and Czechs were excluded, while their former friends chanted, "Jews out, Czechs out." After that, Walter and the other young Jews of Trnava, those in the 8th grade and above, were left to their own devices, wandering around town, no classes to attend and no place to be. Under the new rules, they were barred even from learning alone, which is why Walter and his friend Erwin Eisler went one day to the local council building to hand in their textbooks, obeying an order introduced to guard against the threat of Jewish children studying in their own homes. Walter had complied dutifully, surrendering his books, but Erwin surprised him. Normally, Erwin was bashful, blushing at the mere mention of girls and ducking invitations to join the gangs as they headed to the neighborhood. But on this day, he showed unexpected pluck. "Don't worry," he whispered. "I've still got the chemistry book." He had held on to one of the 2 volumes of Inorganic and Organic Chemistry by the Czech scientist Emil Botoczek. Thereafter, Walter and Erwin would pore over the single text, teaching themselves in secret the knowledge their country was determined to deny them. The self-teaching continued wherever the teenagers got together. Sometimes they gathered in a meadow known after its previous incarnation as the pond, sitting around trying to make sense of the world that seemed to have turned upside down. Walter soon established himself as a dominant presence, his intelligence setting him apart. One girl, 13-year-old Goethe, became steadily more enraptured by him, hanging on his every word. Her parents took him on as a personal tutor, though she doubtless found it hard to concentrate on what he was saying. She hoped he considered her his girlfriend, though the signals could be mixed. One time, they had agreed to meet for a date, but he stood her up. Oh, Walter. Afterwards, Goethe confronted him. He had gone to meet her, he told her, but as he approached, he had seen that she was wearing a hat with pompoms. That had prompted him to run straight around and head in the opposite direction. She looked like a 9-year-old in that hat, he said. He was 15. He could not be seen with a child. And yet, the Jewish teenagers of Trnava had few options beyond each other. They, along with their families, were steadily excluded from the life of the town they had called home. It was the same story across the country. The Tissot regime was determined to impoverish and isolate Jews, first banning them from government jobs, then imposing a quota on the numbers allowed to work in the professions. Later, Jews were banned from owning cars, radios, or even sports equipment. Each new ordinance would be posted on a bulletin board in the center of the town. The Jews would check it every day to see what new humiliation awaited them. Walter and his mother had no assets to speak of, but those Jews who did were stripped of them, bit by bit. First their land was seized, then their businesses expropriated. Aryanization, the authorities called it. Goethe's father tried to keep his butcher shop alive by handing it over to an assistant who had been shrewd enough to join the Flinka party. They called it voluntary Aryanization, by which Jewish-owned businesses would surrender a stake worth at least 51% of the company to a qualified Christian candidate. The name of the program was a stretch because the Nazis did not regard the Slovaks as Aryans, but rather as a category of Slav. As such, they were firmly Untermenschen, an inferior people. There was no hiding place, not even once your front door was closed and you were in your own home. From 1940, as Londoners were enduring the nightly air raids he would soon call the Blitz, Slovak gendarmes took the policy of expropriating Jewish property to a more direct, more literal level. They would enter Jewish homes and loot them, while the children could only stand and watch. They might grab a tennis racket or a coat, a camera or a cherished family heirloom, or even, as in at least one case, a full-sized piano. Sometimes they would venture out of town, finding a Jewish-owned family farm and taking away the animals. It was an open season. If a Jew had it, a Slovak would take it. But the new republic had barely got started. As Walter turned 17 in September 1941, Tisza's government introduced its own version of the Nuremberg laws, the Jewish Codex. Now, Jews were barred from public events, clubs, and social organizations of any kind. They were allowed to venture out or shop only within prescribed hours. They could travel for only limited distances. If they wanted to buy property, they were subjected to a 20% surcharge, a Jew levy. There were limits on where they could live. They were to be confined to a few streets, an early step towards the ghetto. The headline on a pro-government news sheet bragged that in the undeclared contents among fascist states, The strictest laws against Jews are Slovakia's. It's not something to brag about. But the change which had the most immediate, most visible effect on Walter was also the crudest. From now on, any Jew in Slovakia over the age of 6 had to identify themselves by means of a yellow Star of David, 6 inches across and attached to their outer clothes. If Walter and the other Jewish kids pitched up at another skating rink or cinema, one glimpse of the yellow star and they would be turned away. While the friends they once knew were out late on the high street, the Jews were bound by a curfew. They had to be out of sight by 9 p.m. Walter did not rebel against any of these rules. He was not even that shocked by them. Perhaps it was because the ratchet had tightened slowly over the time, so that each new turn did not seem so extraordinary, considering what had come before. Whatever the explanation, Walter wore the yellow star just as he accepted that with his education terminated, he needed to find work. He picked up what he could as manual laborer, but employers only hired Jews if there was no one else available. Any Jew lucky enough to get the day's shift would be paid at a lower rate. There were two wage scales, a lower one for Jews and a higher one for everyone else. This was life for teenage Walter Rosenberg, eating withered schnitzel and fried potato in the cramped kitchen of the home he shared with his mother, attempting to teach himself new languages. In addition to the German, Czech, and Slovak, he already spoke, along with some rudimentary Hungarian, usually from a dog-eared textbook, meeting with his friend at the pond, debating the competing merits of the isms of the age, arguing over whether it was socialism or communism, liberalism or Zionism that would come to their rescue. On the one hand, Zionism's messages of Jewish pride and possibility was bound to young Jews bruised by daily humiliation and exclusion. On the other, surely Zionism was another nationalism doomed to fail in a world that could be healed only by universal brotherhood. And was it not the socialists who were leading the fight against Nazism? They thrashed it out in long hours they spent huddled together, shunned by their neighbors, branded by the yellow stars on their chests. And yet, despite it all, they were still teenagers. There was time for laughing and flirting, for boys to chase girls, girls to chase boys, and for both to break each other's hearts. Walter was not tall, not much more than 5 foot 6 inches, but he carried himself as he were. Those dark eyebrows, his thick head of hair and wide, mischievous smile, but he was never short of attention. Then in February 1942, the letter arrived. It looked like a court summons or a military draft notice, instructing Walter to present himself on this day, at this time, at this place, bringing with him baggage no heavier than 25 kilograms and containing no gold. The message was clear enough. Walter's country was no longer content merely to corral him and his fellow Jews in ever-shrinking spaces with no work and no opportunities. Now it wanted to banish them altogether. Jews were to be stripped of their citizenship, dispatched across the border to Poland to live in what Walter and the others imagined were reservations, like those fenced-in lands they had heard about in America, set aside for Indians. The order came wrapped in a gentle, even genteel language. Jews were not to be deported, still less expelled. No, they were to be resettled. And not all the Jews, only the men, only the able-bodied, only those aged between 16 and 30. If they would agree to go voluntarily, quietly, and without fuss, then nothing would happen to their families, who would be allowed to stay behind and follow later. As for the prohibition on gold, why surely that was obvious. Gold could only have been acquired through deviousness. known through hard work, and therefore any gold that Jews might have in their possession was the rightful property of the Slovak nation, to which, no matter their place of birth, erstwhile citizenship, Jews no longer belonged. Walter stared at the letter that had come through his door, telling him when and where he should present himself. The one thing he knew, as the winter of 1942 gave way to the first intimation of spring, was that he would refuse to be removed from his own country. It struck him as a stupid instruction. No, he would not allow himself to be packed off in a train, destination unknown. Of course, he would do no such thing. He had been born in Slovakia. Slovak was his native tongue. He was a Slovak. He would not be picked up and thrown out like a piece of garbage, leaving his mother defenseless. While she cooked her perennial evening meal of Wiener Schnitzel and apple strudel, Walter told her of his decision. "I'm going to England," he said, "to join the Czechoslovakia army in exile." She looked at him as he were mad. They argued about it for an hour, him in one room, she in the kitchen next door. At intervals, over the din of clanking pots and pans, she would let out a new expression of derision of the very idea. "Why not slip up to the moon and cut yourself a slice of green cheese, but be back in time for supper?" For Ilona, this was typical of her son and his hard-brained schemes, on a par with that crazy business of teaching himself English and Russian. Russian? Why can't you settle down like everyone else and learn a decent trade? These days there was a man in Ilona's life, and he was locksmith. Surely, she said, that was a perfectly respectable occupation. But no, Walter had to do it his own way. "I don't know where we got you. You are certainly not like any side of my family." Besides, she wanted to know how exactly he proposed to reach England. "Through Hungary," he said. True, the government in Budapest was allied to the Nazis, but at least Hungary was not deporting its Jews, then to Yugoslavia. That sparked another round of argument, with Walter unable to specify precisely how he would crisscross occupied Europe, whether by land or sea, and how he would finally reach England. But if he could not get beyond Yugoslavia, he had a contingency plan. He would sign up with the partisans led by Josip Tito and become a resistance fighter. More crashing of saucepans. Round and round they went, Ilona convinced that this was madness and just doomed. But Walter would not back down. Finally, he faced her and said in a calm, steady voice, "Mama, I'm not going to be deported like a calf in wagon." The crashing and shouting stopped. Ilona Rosenberg understood that her son's mind was made up. After that, she became his co-conspirator, assembling the clothes he would need and scrabbling together what little money she had, and coming up with a solution to his most immediate problem: how to get out of the Trnava and to Sered, the town that 5 years before would have been deep in the Slovak interior, but which now hugged the Hungarian border. "You have to take a taxi," she said. Now it was Walter's turn to point out the absurdity. Who ever heard of someone hailing a cab to freedom? And yet he could see there was no other way. There was a driver they knew who might just do it, despite the risk to himself. Ferrying a Jew that kind of distance was strictly forbidden. Still, there were some in Trnava who had not forgotten those they once regarded as neighbors, some who still remembered the depths of friendships. Which is how, one night in early March of 1942, the young Walter Rosenberg came to be crouched on the worn leather seats of one of the few cars in Trnava, a town where a horse-drawn wagon was the norm, heading for the Hungarian border. He did not look back. He was not thinking of the past, nor imagining the future, but rather attending to a task that had to be completed right now, in the present. he looked down and ripped the yellow star from his coat. This was the first chapter in the part 1 of the Escape Artist book. The chapter was called The Star, and next Friday we will read the chapter 2 called 500 Reichmarks, and it will let us know what happened with Walter once he crossed the Hungarian border. I hope this was informative for you as it was for me. We all know some stories, and we all know on the surface what was going on during the Second World War and in Auschwitz, but I assume not many of us knew these kind of details, and how was it for people and for teenagers to live in that time in Slovakia, in Czechia, in all the countries occupied by the Germans, and in Yugoslavia. I'm from former Yugoslavia, now Serbia. So if you think that there is someone who would appreciate hearing this story, please share this video with them. And if you have any comment, please let me know what you think about what we have heard so far. Thank you and bye.